The world knew Whitney Houston as the voice that could move mountains. December 1999, Johannesburg, South Africa. 12,000 people packed into Ellis Park Stadium for a concert honoring Nelson Mandela's legacy of reconciliation and hope. Whitney was scheduled to perform her most iconic song, the anthem that had defined her career and inspired millions around the world, "Greatest Love of All." But when she stepped into that spotlight and opened her mouth to sing the first line, something went terribly wrong. Her voice, that legendary instrument that had carried her through countless performances, cracked on the very first note. The woman who had sung for presidents and royalty, who had delivered flawless performances in front of billions, suddenly couldn't get through the opening phrase of her signature song. What happened next left 12,000 people in stunned silence. And what Nelson Mandela told her backstage that night would change Whitney's understanding of strength, vulnerability, and what it truly means to love yourself. The invitation to perform at Nelson Mandela's AIDS benefit concert had arrived at Whitney's management office in September 1999. At first glance, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. Mandela, newly retired from the presidency of South Africa, was using his global influence to address the AIDS crisis that was devastating his country and the continent. The concert would raise funds and awareness, bringing together international artists to support a cause that desperately needed attention. For Whitney, this should have been an honor she accepted immediately. Performing for Mandela, a man who represented triumph over oppression and the power of forgiveness, should have been the highlight of her year. But by late 1999, Whitney Houston was fighting battles that had nothing to do with music. Her marriage to Bobby Brown had become increasingly turbulent, with tabloids documenting their volatile relationship in excruciating detail. Her voice, the foundation of her identity and career, was showing signs of damage from years of strain and substance abuse. And most painfully, she was struggling with the gap between who the world thought she was and who she knew herself to be. Clive Davis, Whitney's longtime mentor and president of Arista Records, was deeply concerned about her accepting the Mandela concert. He had noticed the deterioration in her voice during recent recording sessions, the way she now needed multiple takes for songs she once would have nailed in one. He called her repeatedly, urging her to reconsider. "Whitney, you're not ready for this," Clive told her during one particularly tense phone conversation. "This isn't just any concert. This is Mandela. The whole world will be watching. If something goes wrong, it won't just be a bad performance. It will become a defining moment." But Whitney was determined to accept the invitation. She saw it as an opportunity to prove to herself, to Clive, to the world that she was still Whitney Houston. That despite everything happening in her personal life, despite the whispers about her voice and her marriage, she could still deliver when it mattered most. Robin Crawford, Whitney's closest friend and former creative director, understood the deeper motivation. Whitney needed this concert, Robin later revealed. Not for her career, not for the money, but because she was desperately trying to hold on to her identity as an artist. She thought that if she could stand on that stage and sing for Mandela, she could prove that she was still whole. The preparation for the Johannesburg concert became increasingly difficult as December approached. Whitney's vocal coach, Gary Katona, worked with her intensively, but he could hear the damage that years of strain had inflicted on her instrument. Her upper register, once effortless and pure, now required significant effort. Her breathing control, previously flawless, had become inconsistent. During one particularly frustrating rehearsal session in New York, Whitney broke down completely. Gary had asked her to run through Greatest Love of All one more time, focusing on the challenging bridge section. She made it halfway through before her voice cracked on a note she had sung perfectly thousands of times before. She stopped singing, walked away from the microphone, and sat on the rehearsal room floor with her head in her hands. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. "I don't know who I am without this voice." Gary, who had worked with Whitney for years and witnessed her at both her highest peaks and lowest valleys, sat beside her. "Whitney, your voice is incredible, but it's not who you are. You are so much more than the notes you can hit." But Whitney couldn't hear that truth. For her entire life, her voice had been her value. From childhood, singing in her mother Sissy's church, through her meteoric rise to superstardom, her vocal ability had been the thing that made her special, that made her worthy of love and admiration. The thought of losing that was terrifying beyond measure. The flight to Johannesburg was long and tense. Whitney traveled with a small entourage, including her vocal coach, her assistant, and surprisingly, her daughter Bobby Christina, who was 6 years old. Bobby Brown had been scheduled to accompany them, but had canceled at the last minute, citing work commitments. Those close to Whitney knew the real reason. He and Whitney had been fighting constantly, and the tension between them had reached a breaking point. During the 15-hour flight, Whitney barely slept. She spent hours in the airplane bathroom, running through vocal exercises, testing her range, trying to reassure herself that she could deliver the performance. Her assistant, Mary Jones, later described finding Whitney crying in the galley at 3 in the morning. She kept saying, "I have to be perfect. Mandela deserves perfect. I can't let him down." When they landed in Johannesburg on December 10th, Whitney was greeted by representatives from the Mandela Foundation and local media. She smiled for cameras, waved to fans who had gathered at the airport, and gave a brief statement about how honored she was to be performing. But those who knew her could see the exhaustion in her eyes and the tension in her shoulders. The rehearsal at Ellis Park Stadium the day before the concert revealed just how unprepared Whitney was. The acoustics in a massive outdoor venue were challenging, and Whitney struggled to hear herself properly through the monitors. She ran through Greatest Love of All twice during soundcheck, and both times her voice sounded thin and strained. The sound engineers scrambled to adjust the mix, trying to give her more support, but the fundamental problem wasn't technical. It was that Whitney's instrument was damaged, and no amount of engineering could fix that. That evening, Whitney was scheduled to have dinner with some of the other performers and members of the Mandela Foundation. She canceled, saying she needed rest. Instead, she spent the evening in her hotel room with Bobby Christina, ordering room service and watching South African television. Mary Jones checked on them around 9 o'clock and found Whitney teaching Bobby Christina the words to Greatest Love of All. The little girl was singing along enthusiastically, her pure, untrained voice filling the hotel room with joy. Mary noticed tears streaming down Whitney's face as she listened to her daughter sing. "That's when I realized what this performance really meant to her," Mary later said. She wasn't just singing for Mandela or for the cause. She was singing to prove to herself that she was still the person her daughter could look up to. December 11th, 1999. Concert day arrived with brilliant South African summer sunshine. Ellis Park Stadium began filling early with 12,000 people who had purchased tickets to support the AIDS benefit and witness performances by some of the world's greatest artists. The lineup included Lionel Richie, Montserrat Cabal, Queen, and Whitney Houston as the headline act. Backstage, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation and purpose. Artists mingled, sharing stories about what Mandela's example had meant to them personally. Nelson Mandela himself arrived in the afternoon, moving slowly through the backstage area with his characteristic dignity and warmth. He greeted each performer personally, thanking them for their support and sharing brief words of encouragement. When he reached Whitney's dressing room, she was in the middle of vocal warm-ups with Gary Katona. Mandela waited patiently outside until she finished, then knocked gently on the door. Whitney opened it to find the man who had spent 27 years in prison and emerged without bitterness, who had led his country from apartheid to democracy, standing humbly in her doorway. "Mr. President," she said, suddenly feeling foolish for worrying about a concert when standing before someone who had endured such genuine suffering. Mandela smiled with such warmth that Whitney felt some of her anxiety ease. "Please, just Nelson. I want to thank you personally for being here. Your music has brought joy to so many people, including me." They spoke for nearly 20 minutes, and Whitney later told Robin that Mandela had an ability to make you feel like you were the only person in the world. He asked about Bobby Christina, about Whitney's mother Sissy, about her experience visiting South Africa for the first time. He didn't mention the concert or ask her to sing. He simply connected with her as one human being to another. As the concert began and the South African summer evening cooled into night, Whitney stood in the wings watching the other performers. Lionel Richie delivered a flawless set. Queen, performing with a guest vocalist, brought the crowd to their feet. Each performance raised the bar, and with each one, Whitney felt her anxiety increasing. Gary Katona stayed close to her, leading her through gentle vocal exercises between acts. But he could see the fear in her eyes. She was terrified, and fear is the enemy of vocal performance. It tenses the muscles, constricts the breathing, and creates the very problems a singer is trying to avoid. Finally, as the sun set completely and stars began appearing in the clear Johannesburg sky, Whitney's moment arrived. The announcer's voice boomed across the stadium. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage a voice that has moved the world, performing her iconic anthem in support of this vital cause, Miss Whitney Houston. The crowd erupted in applause as Whitney walked onto the stage. She wore an elegant white gown that caught the stage lights beautifully, and to the audience, she looked every bit the superstar they expected. But inside, Whitney was experiencing something close to panic. The roar of 12,000 people, the significance of performing for Mandela, the weight of her own expectations, all crashed down on her simultaneously. She took her position at the microphone stand, smiled broadly at the crowd, and waited for her musical introduction to begin. The familiar piano opening of Greatest Love of All filled the stadium. This was the moment Whitney had performed hundreds of times before, the moment she should have been able to do in her sleep. But as the introduction played and the moment came for her to sing the opening line, something inside her froze. "I believe the children are our future." That's all she had to sing. 7 simple words that had opened her signature song countless times before. Words she had sung perfectly at the Grammy Awards, at the Super Bowl, at venues around the world. But when Whitney opened her mouth on that Johannesburg stage, what came out was not the pure, powerful voice the world knew. Her voice cracked immediately, breaking on the word believe with an audible strain that sent a shock through the stadium. 12,000 people, who had been cheering enthusiastically just seconds before, fell into confused silence. Whitney's eyes widened in horror as she heard her own voice betray her. She tried to push through to the next line, but her vocal cords, already damaged and now seized with tension, produced only a thin, strained sound that bore no resemblance to her legendary instrument. "Teach them well and let them lead the way." The line came out weak and breathy, with none of the power or beauty that defined Whitney Houston. In the audience, people began looking at each other in confusion. This couldn't be Whitney Houston. Something must be wrong with the sound system. But those closer to the stage could see the truth on Whitney's face. The sudden paleness, the way her hands gripped the microphone stand, the terror in her eyes. This was not a technical problem. This was a woman's voice failing her at the most crucial moment. Gary Katona, watching from the wings, felt his heart sink. He had feared this might happen, had warned that Whitney wasn't ready, but hoping to be wrong and watching it actually occur were two different things. Whitney tried once more to sing the next line, but this time her voice cracked so severely that she stopped singing altogether. She stood at the microphone, breathing heavily, as the backing track continued to play without her voice. The stadium had gone completely silent now. No one was cheering, no one was singing along. 12,000 people were simply watching in stunned disbelief as one of the greatest voices of all time proved unable to sing her own signature song. For a moment that felt like an eternity, Whitney just stood there. The backing track played on, reaching the point where she should have been singing the chorus, but no sound came from her. And then, in front of 12,000 people and the television cameras broadcasting to millions more, Whitney Houston did something she had never done in her entire professional career. She stepped back from the microphone, covered her face with her hands, and began to cry. Not the delicate, camera-ready tears of a performer moved by emotion, but the raw, broken sobbing of someone whose worst fear has just come true. Her shoulders shook with the force of her crying, and the sound of her anguish was picked up by the sensitive stage microphones, broadcast throughout the stadium. The backing track continued its relentless progression, now a cruel reminder of what should have been happening, what always had happened before. But Whitney couldn't sing. She couldn't do anything but stand there crying, her identity as a performer, as an artist, as the voice that moved mountains, crumbling in front of the world. The audience reaction was remarkable. There was no booing, no angry shouts demanding refunds. Instead, a ripple of compassionate murmuring moved through the crowd. These people had come to support a cause championed by Nelson Mandela, a man who embodied compassion and humanity. They recognized that they were witnessing not a diva's tantrum, but a human being's genuine breakdown. Mary Jones rushed onto the stage from the wings, wrapping her arms around Whitney's trembling shoulders. Security personnel moved toward the stage, unsure whether to escort Whitney off or wait for instruction. The show's director frantically signaled for the backing track to be stopped, and suddenly the stadium was silent except for the sound of Whitney's crying. Backstage, Nelson Mandela, who had been watching the performance from a monitor, immediately stood and began making his way toward the stage entrance. His security detail tried to slow him down, concerned about the unplanned movement, but Mandela waved them off with gentle insistence. Something important was happening, and he needed to be present for it. Gary Katona reached Whitney first, gently taking her hands and speaking quietly. "It's okay, Whitney. It's okay. Let's get you off stage. We can figure this out." But Whitney pulled away from him, shaking her head violently. She tried to speak, to say something to the confused audience, but her voice, already failing for singing, now failed even for speaking. All that came out was a choked whisper that the microphones barely picked up. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." What happened next would become one of the most powerful moments in concert history, though not for any reason anyone had anticipated. Nelson Mandela walked slowly onto the Ellis Park Stadium stage, his presence immediately commanding attention even without spotlights or announcement. The crowd, recognizing their beloved Madiba, began to applaud, but Mandela raised his hand gently, asking for quiet. He walked directly to Whitney, who was still crying with her hands covering her face. The world watched as this man, who had endured 27 years of imprisonment and emerged with his humanity intact, approached one of music's biggest stars in her moment of complete vulnerability. Mandela reached Whitney and, with remarkable gentleness for a man in his 80s, placed both hands on her shoulders. "Whitney," he said, his voice quiet but picked up clearly by the stage microphones. "Whitney, please look at me." Whitney lowered her hands slowly, revealing a face streaked with tears and makeup, her eyes filled with shame and devastation. Mandela looked directly into those eyes with such compassion that people in the front rows later reported they began crying themselves just witnessing the exchange. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" Mandela asked, his voice carrying across the now silent stadium. Whitney shook her head, unable to speak. Mandela continued, "I see a brave woman who came to support a cause she believes in. I see a mother who brought her daughter to teach her about service. I see someone who is struggling with something difficult and had the courage to try anyway." The stadium remained absolutely silent as Mandela continued speaking, his words not just for Whitney, but for everyone listening. "For 27 years, I was in prison. For 27 years, people told me I was nothing, that I had no value, that I should give up hope. But I learned something during that time. I learned that our value as human beings has nothing to do with our achievements or our abilities. Our value is inherent. We are worthy of love and respect simply because we exist." He gently turned Whitney toward the audience, keeping one hand on her shoulder. "This woman," he said to the crowd, "has brought joy to millions with her voice. She has used her gift to lift spirits and inspire hope. But tonight, she is teaching us something even more important. She is teaching us that it is okay to be vulnerable, okay to struggle, okay to fail. These lessons are more valuable than any perfect performance." The crowd began to applaud, slowly at first, then building into a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. But they weren't applauding a performance. They were applauding Mandela's words and Whitney's humanity. Mandela turned back to Whitney, speaking more quietly now, words meant primarily for her though the microphone still captured them. "You do not need to sing to have value, Whitney. You do not need to be perfect to be loved. You simply need to be yourself in all your beautiful, struggling, human imperfection." Whitney collapsed against Mandela, sobbing now with what sounded like relief rather than shame. Mandela held her, this towering figure of moral authority embracing a broken artist, showing the world what true compassion looks like. After several minutes, Mandela gently guided Whitney to the edge of the stage where Mary and Gary were waiting. He said something to them that the microphones didn't catch, then returned to the center of the stage. He addressed the crowd directly, his voice strong and clear despite his age. "My friends, tonight we have witnessed something more powerful than any concert performance. We have seen a human being be courageously vulnerable. We have seen the truth that our worth is not determined by what we can do, but by who we are. The cause we gather for tonight, fighting AIDS, requires this same compassion. It requires us to see the humanity in everyone, especially those who are struggling. Tonight, Whitney Houston has given us a gift more valuable than her voice. She has given us her authentic self. Let's honor that gift with our compassion." The crowd erupted again, and this time the applause continued for over 10 minutes. People were crying, embracing each other, and experiencing something profound that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with human connection. Backstage, Whitney was taken to a private room where she could compose herself away from cameras and crowds. Bobby Christina, who had been watching from the wings with one of Whitney's assistants, ran to her mother and wrapped her small arms around her waist. "Mommy, are you okay?" the 6-year-old asked, her voice filled with concern. Whitney knelt down to her daughter's level, and for the first time that evening, she smiled genuinely. "I am now, baby. I really am." About an hour later, after the concert had concluded with other artists performing extended sets to fill the time, Nelson Mandela requested a private meeting with Whitney. They met in a quiet room in the stadium's administrative area, with only Mandela's aide and Whitney's assistant present, both maintaining a respectful distance. Mandela settled into a chair with the careful movements of an elderly man, then gestured for Whitney to sit across from him. "I want to speak with you more privately," he began, "because I believe you and I share something important. We both know what it is like to be imprisoned." Whitney looked confused. "Mr. President, I've never been to prison." Mandela smiled gently. "There are many kinds of prisons, my dear. Mine had walls and bars. Yours has expectations and perfectionism. But both keep us from being fully ourselves." What followed was a conversation that Whitney would later describe as life-changing. Mandela shared stories from his years in prison, about the moments when he felt most hopeless, most defeated. He talked about the letters he received from supporters around the world and how those letters sustained him, but also how they created pressure. "People saw me as a symbol," he said. "They needed me to be strong, to be unbreakable, to never show weakness. And I believed I had to be that person for them. But the truth is I was often frightened, often sad, often filled with doubt. It was only when I accepted that I could be both strong and afraid, both hopeful and sad, that I found real peace." Whitney listened, tears streaming quietly down her face. "That's exactly how I feel," she whispered. "Everyone expects me to be this perfect voice, this flawless performer. But I'm not perfect. I'm struggling with so many things, and I feel like if people see the real me, they won't love me anymore." Mandela leaned forward, his eyes intense with compassion. "Whitney, people do not love you because you are perfect. They love you because your voice touches something in their hearts. And tonight, your vulnerability touched their hearts more deeply than any perfect performance ever could." He continued, "I spent 27 years learning that freedom is not the absence of struggle. Freedom is the ability to be yourself with all your struggles and know that you are still worthy of love. Tonight, you are more free than you have perhaps ever been in your life." Whitney asked the question that had been haunting her. "But what do I do now? How do I move forward when everyone has seen me fail?" Mandela's response was immediate and firm. "You did not fail tonight, Whitney. You succeeded in being human. The failure would have been pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. The failure would have been continuing to imprison yourself in other people's expectations." He stood slowly, preparing to leave, but turned back to Whitney with one final thought. "The greatest love of all is not learning to love yourself by achieving perfection. It is learning to love yourself despite your imperfections. That is the message of your song, and tonight you lived it in the most powerful way possible." After Mandela left, Whitney sat alone for a long time, processing his words. Mary eventually came to check on her and found her staring out a window at the Johannesburg night sky. "Mary," Whitney said without turning around, "I think I've been trying to earn love my entire life. I thought if I sang well enough, was successful enough, perfect enough, then I would deserve to be loved." Mary moved to stand beside her. "And now?" Whitney smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes for the first time in months. "Now I think maybe I was already worthy. Maybe I always was." The Johannesburg concert became international news, but not in the way anyone expected. Rather than focusing on Whitney's vocal failure, media coverage centered on Mandela's compassionate response and the powerful moment of human connection. The headline in the New York Times read, "Mandela's Grace. When perfection fails, humanity succeeds." The Associated Press story led with Whitney Houston's breakdown becomes breakthrough in message of compassion. Rolling Stone published a thoughtful essay about the pressure on performers and the unrealistic expectations of perfection. Music critics who had built careers on harsh reviews began writing more compassionately about artist struggles. The incident sparked conversations in the entertainment industry about vocal health, the pressure on performers, and the need for more humane treatment of artists. Several major artists came forward with their own stories of vocal struggles, creating space for honesty that hadn't existed before. Celine Dion gave an interview where she revealed her own battles with vocal strain and the terror of losing her instrument. Mariah Carey spoke publicly about the anxiety she felt before every performance, knowing that people were judging her against an impossible standard. Barbra Streisand, who had dealt with decades of performance anxiety, wrote a letter to Whitney that was later published with permission. She wrote, "You gave us all a gift in Johannesburg by showing that vulnerability is not weakness. It is the highest form of courage." For Whitney personally, the Johannesburg experience marked a turning point, though not an instant transformation. The problems in her life, the damage to her voice, the struggles in her marriage, didn't disappear because of one powerful moment. But something fundamental had shifted in how she understood her own worth. In the weeks following the concert, Whitney made several important decisions. She canceled her remaining tour dates for late 1999 and early 2000, issuing a statement that she needed time to rest her voice and address health concerns. She began working with a therapist who specialized in helping performers deal with identity issues and the pressure of fame. She spent extended time with Bobby Christina, trying to be more present as a mother and less consumed by career pressure. Most significantly, Whitney began speaking more openly about her struggles. In an interview with Oprah Winfrey in early 2000, she talked about the Johannesburg concert and what it had taught her. "For so long, I believed that I was my voice," Whitney told Oprah. "I thought that if I couldn't sing perfectly, I had no value. What Mandela showed me that night was that I am so much more than what I can do. I am a mother, a daughter, a friend, a human being who is struggling and trying and sometimes failing, and that is okay." The interview was watched by over 20 million people and generated thousands of letters from fans sharing their own struggles with perfectionism and self-worth. Whitney's relationship with her mother, Cissy, also began to heal during this period. Cissy, who had built her own career as a gospel singer and had always pushed Whitney toward excellence, watched the Johannesburg footage and saw her daughter's pain clearly for the first time. She flew to Los Angeles to spend time with Whitney, and they had long conversations about expectations, pressure, and love. Cissy later gave an interview where she took responsibility for some of the pressure Whitney had always felt. "I wanted her to be great," Cissy said, tears in her eyes. "I wanted her to have all the success I never had. But I didn't realize I was teaching her that she had to earn love through achievement." What happened in Johannesburg was painful to watch as a mother, but it also opened my eyes to how much my daughter has been suffering. The vocal damage Whitney experienced was real and would continue to affect her performances for the rest of her career. She worked extensively with vocal therapists and made modifications to her technique, but the effortless power of her early years never fully returned. However, her performances took on a different quality. They became more emotionally raw, more connected, less about technical perfection and more about genuine feeling. Critics who reviewed her subsequent concerts often noted this change. A review of her 2000 concert in Chicago observed, "Whitney Houston may not have the same technical perfection she once possessed, but she now sings with a depth of emotion and vulnerability that is far more moving than any perfect high note." The Johannesburg concert and its aftermath influenced how the music industry approached artist well-being. Several major record labels implemented new policies around artist health, including mandatory vocal rest periods and access to mental health resources. The conversation about perfectionism in performance art expanded beyond music to include dance, theater, and other disciplines. Performers began speaking more openly about their struggles, creating a culture where asking for help was seen as strength rather than weakness. Nelson Mandela and Whitney remained in contact periodically until his death in 2013. They exchanged letters, and Mandela always asked about Bobby Christina in his correspondence. When Whitney performed at events in South Africa in later years, Mandela would send flowers with notes of encouragement. One note, which Whitney kept framed in her home, read simply, "Remember, you are worthy." Always. The message Mandela shared that night in Johannesburg, that our value is inherent rather than earned, became central to how Whitney spoke about her own journey. In interviews throughout the 2000s, she repeatedly returned to that theme. "I spent so much of my life trying to prove I was good enough," she told a reporter in 2003. "What I learned from Nelson Mandela is that I was always good enough. I just needed to believe it." For young artists watching Whitney's journey, the Johannesburg incident provided a powerful lesson. Perfection was not the goal. Authenticity was. Being real about struggles was more valuable than pretending everything was always fine. When Whitney died in February 2012, the tributes that poured and remembered not just her incredible voice and chart-topping successes, but also her humanity and vulnerability. The Johannesburg concert was mentioned in nearly every major obituary, not as an embarrassing failure, but as a moment of profound courage. The Nelson Mandela Foundation released a statement after Whitney's death. Madiba always said that Whitney Houston taught the world an important lesson in Johannesburg. She showed us that true strength lies not in never falling, but in how we rise after we fall. Her vulnerability that evening touched millions of hearts, including Madiba's. We honor her memory and her courage. At Whitney's funeral, several speakers referenced the Johannesburg concert and its lessons. Clive Davis, who had warned Whitney not to accept the concert invitation, spoke about how wrong he had been. "I thought that night was going to be the end of Whitney's career," he said from the pulpit, but it turned out to be one of her most important moments. "She taught us all that it's okay to not be perfect, that our struggles don't define us, and that vulnerability is a form of strength." Robin Crawford, speaking to close friends after the funeral, reflected on what that night had meant in the broader context of Whitney's life. "She struggled so much with feeling like she had to be perfect for everyone," Robin said. "That night in Johannesburg was the first time she really let the world see her as she was, not as she thought she should be. And the world loved her more for it, not less." Bobby Christina, who had been only 6 years old during the Johannesburg concert, later spoke about how that night had affected her understanding of her mother. "I remember being scared when Mommy cried on stage," she told an interviewer in 2010. "But then this kind old man came out and made everything okay. Later, when I was older and understood what had happened, I realized that was one of the bravest things my mother ever did. She let everyone see that she was human." The footage of the Johannesburg concert, including Mandela's intervention, became one of the most viewed music moments on early YouTube. Comment sections filled with people sharing how the video had helped them deal with their own struggles with perfectionism, fear of failure, and feelings of unworthiness. One comment, which received over 50,000 likes, read, "This is more powerful than any perfect performance. This is what it looks like to be human." Music schools and performing arts programs began using the Johannesburg footage as a teaching tool, not to show what happens when a performance goes wrong, but to demonstrate the power of authenticity and the importance of compassion. The incident became a case study in handling crisis with grace, in choosing humanity over image, and in redefining what success really means. Mental health organizations focused on perfectionism and self-worth also embraced the Johannesburg story. Brené Brown, the research professor who studies vulnerability and shame, frequently referenced Whitney's experience in her lectures and books. "What Whitney Houston showed us in Johannesburg," Brown wrote, "is that our imperfections and vulnerabilities are not things to be hidden or fixed. They're the most human parts of us, and when we have the courage to show them, we give others permission to do the same." The greatest love of all, the song Whitney couldn't sing that night, took on new meaning after Johannesburg. When people heard it in subsequent years, they heard not just the lyrics about loving yourself, but they remembered the powerful lesson of that night. That loving yourself means accepting yourself as you are, struggles and all. December 1999 in Johannesburg was not the end of Whitney Houston's struggles. Her marriage to Bobby Brown would end in divorce. Her battles with substance abuse would continue. The damage to her voice would never fully heal. And tragically, her life would end too soon at age 48 in a Beverly Hills hotel room. But that night in Johannesburg, standing on a stage in front of 12,000 people with her voice failing and her worst fear realized, Whitney Houston discovered something that would sustain her through all the difficult years ahead. She discovered that she was loved not for what she could do, but for who she was. That she was worthy not because of her achievements, but simply because she existed. That vulnerability was not weakness, but courage. Nelson Mandela, who had spent 27 years in prison and emerged with his humanity intact, gave Whitney a gift that night. He showed her that real freedom comes not from meeting everyone's expectations, but from accepting yourself with all your imperfections. He demonstrated that true strength is not never falling, but being brave enough to stand back up and keep trying. The world remembers Whitney Houston for many things. Her incredible voice that could soar to impossible heights. Her record-breaking success. Her legendary performances. But perhaps the most important thing she taught us happened on a night when her voice failed completely. She taught us that it's okay to struggle, okay to be imperfect, okay to be vulnerably beautifully, messily human. And sometimes, the greatest love of all is learning to love yourself not despite your failures, but through them. This powerful story shows us that our worth is never determined by our achievements or abilities, but by our inherent humanity. Whitney Houston's moment of vulnerability in Johannesburg became a moment of transformation, not just for her, but for everyone who witnessed it. Nelson Mandela's compassionate response reminded the world that true leadership is about lifting up those who are struggling, not judging them. What would happen if we all extended the same grace to ourselves that Mandela showed Whitney that night? How would your life change if you truly believed you were worthy exactly as you are? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message of self-acceptance and compassion. Subscribe and ring that notification bell because we have more incredible stories that show the humanity behind music's greatest legends. Until next time, remember that the greatest love of all truly is learning to love yourself, imperfections included.